All right, we're going to get started.
Okay.
Hello and welcome back to our Authors on Tap reading series. I am Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, run Exile in Bookville here in the historic Fine Arts Building on Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. We are very excited about tonight for a ton of reasons, one being that this evening we kick off a new monthly event series in conjunction with Bloomsbury Publishing, but more specifically with their 33 1/3 music book series. If you aren't familiar with 33 1/3, they are a collection of short books about popular music focusing on individual albums by artists ranging from James Brown to Celine Dion, J Dilla to Neutral Milk Hotel. Each album covered in the series occupies such a specific place in music history, so each book-length treatment is different. Jonathan Lethem, Colin Meloy, Daphne Brooks, Gina, Arnold, and Alan Warner are just some of the authors who have contributed to this series so far. It is a series that, as you can see behind me, we have really gotten behind here at Exile. And tonight we begin in fine fashion as we host Erin Osmon, whose 33 1/3 contribution on John Prine's self-titled album is the latest to be published by Bloomsbury. It's the 160th in the series. Erin will be in conversation with Leor Galil, so let's meet them both and get the show on the road.
Thanks, Javier.
Erin Osmon, I'm going to just give you a quick
Okay.
Your quick little bio, of course.
Great.
And thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys both for being here. This is so exciting. Like, I'm so glad this is our first event of the year. Erin Osmon is a Midwest native and veteran of Chicago newsrooms, whose music journalism and criticism appears in Uncut, Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, the New York Times, The Guardian, and many other publications. Her debut book, Jason Molina, Writing with the Ghost, was named a Best Music Book of 2017 by Pitchfork. She is also the author of long-form album notes for box set reissues by bands like Blondie and Hüsker Dü. She teaches at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School. Leor Galil serves as the Reader's music writer. He began freelancing for the Reader in 2010 and joined the staff in 2012. He's also written for the Washington Post, Pitchfork, RollingStone.com, the Washington City Paper, and the AV Club, among other outlets. We really appreciate you all for tuning in tonight, and we encourage you all to keep your cameras on, but please mute yourselves throughout the event. Should you have any questions or comments, feel free to type them into the chat, and Leor will be sure to pass those along to Erin. You can purchase copies of John Prine through the link in the chat, and each book will come with a signed bookplate. I'll step aside now and pass this along to Erin and Leor, so please enjoy the show, and good luck, you guys. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. I just want to say that I'm so excited to be here with my friend Leor. Leor and I met a million years ago when we were assigned to cover a music festival together in Chicago.
For the AV Club.
For the AV Club, yes, which is RIP. Yeah, and Leor is one of the things that I miss most about Chicago. So I'm so honored that you did this with me. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And Erin is the best, and I really miss being able to hang out with her often. She's one of the last people I saw before the pandemic hit. So it's great to see you again over video chat. And I loved your book, and I loved your previous book. So it's great I can't wait to talk to you more about this one. Yeah, do you have a chapter you want to read? You ready to
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'll start by reading a short chapter. I love this chapter because I think as Chicago locals, most of y'all will be sort of familiar with this story. But I think, through my reporting, I bring some extra details that maybe you haven't heard before. So maybe this is a nice preview for the rest of the book. So this is chapter 6, and it's called And Then He Has You. The story of Prine's first nightclub performance and subsequent discovery has been recounted so many times that it seems apocryphal, a plot point whose details have been softened and molded into an enticing soundbite. As with many oral traditions, it's difficult to tell the difference between the truth and the tale. But music's best storyteller was in fact launched by this great story, a mirror between life and art whose poetic underpinnings are perfect reflections of Prine's inimitable work. And it all happened one warm summer night in 1970 at a little Chicago folk music club when John Prine was just 23 years old. As Prine told it, he was one of a handful of guitar students in the audience at the Fifth Peg one night after class, kvetching over a couple of beers. Quote, "I made a remark about the people who were getting up to sing. This is awful," he said. Quote, "So the people I was sitting with said, you get up and try, and I did." But Ray Tate remembered it differently. Ray Tate was Prine's guitar teacher. Tate said that he recalled Prine came into the club one night when the house and the open mic schedule was packed. Quote, "He waited around for a while and he wasn't too happy about it," Tate said. Unable to put him up, Tate invited Prine to come back the next week and promised to give him a spot. Quote, "I felt terrible having to send him home without putting him on the stage," he said. When Prine returned, he didn't have to wait too long. This is where Prine and Tate's memories converge. After performing Sam Stone, which was then titled Great Society Conflict Veterans Blues, the audience of about 10 or so fell mute. It was the kind of awkward silence that makes seconds feel like centuries. Quote, "I thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble," Prine said. But the entire room, including Prine's teacher, erupted in applause, unsure what they'd just witnessed, but confident it was important. Quote, "I was really impressed by how beautiful the songs were, how well written and clever," Tate said. Prine also performed Paradise and Old People, which was later titled Hello in There, shaky but determined to get through it. Whether Prine reluctantly took to the stage or, as Tate remembered, vied for a spot, one thing is certain, he was nervous. John and Dave, his older brother, had performed covers at the dedication of the Fred Hampton Pool during the 1969 Maywood Folk Festival, a short-lived suburban celebration founded by a neighborhood friend. Quote, "We were the only white folks there," Dave recalled. Prine had given plenty of living room performances, but he hadn't tested any of his original songs on a live audience that wasn't his family. Quote, "I was writing these songs totally for myself, not thinking anyone was ever going to hear them," Prine said. "And I went from that to being a very nervous public performer who had no voice whatsoever. To sing for other people was really painful." Prine explained that in his earliest days, he spoke the words to his songs, fast or slow depending on the melody, and held certain notes to let the audience know he was transitioning to a new idea. Quote, "That's how limited I was," he said. Eventually, he settled into a nasal, twang-infused delivery that would elicit a million comparisons to Bob Dylan. But for now, he was a mailman at the crossroads of a curious proposition. According to Prine, someone who worked at the club offered him a regular gig on the spot, but that may be an exaggeration. The offer may have come after a few open mic gigs, as others have remembered. What's certain is the popularity of his appearances happened with unbelievable speed. Prine began playing Sunday nights, earning half of the door in June and July of 1970. He was then promoted to Friday and Saturday nights in the fall. Quote, "When they started charging people to get in, we would get a cut of that," his first wife, Ann Carol Menelaskino, recalled. Quote, "So I would stand by the door and collect something like $2.50 from each person." Ed Holstein, who worked at the Old Town School store across the street, had also become a part-time bartender at the Fifth Peg and took up one of Prine's earliest performances, wandering in on a night off from work. Quote, "He played Illegal Smile, Paradise, Hello in There, and Sam Stone, and it was pretty amazing. The songs were so powerful. I knew right away that something was going on," he said. Quote, "I immediately told my brother Fred and Steve Goodman about him." As momentum began to build, Prine worried that he didn't have enough songs, that his set was becoming redundant for repeat patrons. So he wrote Souvenirs, included on his second album, Diamonds in the Rough, in his 65 Chevelle while driving to the Fifth Peg. Prine explained that he set out to write the most sophisticated melody he could muster, and it is more complex than the songs that comprise John Prine, Twinkling Like a Constellation. Quote, "I thought I'd written a jazz melody," he explained. "I was surprised to find out it had the same 3 chords as all my other songs." Its imagery and emotion originates from a carnival Prine attended with his brothers when they were young. Amid the festivities, his oldest brother Dave wandered off, and Prine was convinced he'd never find him again, an unprecedented, overwhelming fear that burned in his memory. Quote, "I kept that emotion buried somewhere, and it came out in Souvenirs," he said. Prine also recalled the image of Dave after they reunited, holding the small plastic horses, souvenirs from the carnival, but also of Prine's memory, a crystallized moment of relief. As the months wore on, more and more faces from the Chicago folk music scene wandered in to catch Prine on word-of-mouth recommendation. Steve Goodman came in a couple of times, first with the Holstein brothers, Fred and Ed, and later with rising local singer Bonnie Kolak, whose glassy voice was the perfect instrument for bare folk songs, but dynamic enough for jazz sophistication and emotive blues, which she often incorporated in her sets. She'd come to Chicago from Iowa in late 1968, hoping to break into the thriving Northside club scene, and almost immediately landed a gig as house performer at the Quiet Night. Quote, "The first time I saw John play, I walked up to him and I said, 'You don't have to worry about a thing because your gift will carry you through,'" Kolak recalled. He had this wry way and this interesting way of looking at the world, and he could project that into his writing. He had no pretense. Prine and the Holsteins became buddies, jamming together in the brothers' apartments or commiserating over beers. Fred was older, a scholar of folk music, and Ed shared in Prine's love of a good hard laugh. Both brothers worked in the Old Town School store selling strings and other accoutrements. Quote, Eddie and me, we used to go to lunch together because I used to like to watch Eddie eat, Prine said. He'd eat for hours, and he was just a little skinny guy then, and you'd wonder where the food was. Fred Holstein was one of the few people Prine knew who had a reel-to-reel recorder, and he tracked demos for Prine after he'd written a song. Quote, he'd bring it over, and then Fred would do it that night, Ed Holstein said. People wanted to do Prine songs right away. One day, Ed shared a couple of melodies he'd written and asked if Prine had any lyrics, thinking they could come up with a co-write. Quote, he had one verse, I am an old woman. And I was looking for something a little bit more like, there's a hole in daddy's arm, he said. That one verse soon became one of Prine's most beloved songs, Angel from Montgomery, but Holstein just couldn't see it at the time. It just didn't move me, he said. It became a much better song later. Though Ed turned down Prine's idea of a middle-aged woman who feels older than she is, a rejection that would haunt him the rest of his life, it stuck with Prine, and so he finished Angel from Montgomery soon after their exchange in 1970. Prine believed the setting was inspired by Hank Williams. Montgomery, Alabama is where the country icon's career began and where it ended when he was laid to rest. But Holstein has posited that it was drawn from the spirit of progress, a bronze statue of an angelic woman on top of the old Montgomery Ward headquarters on Chicago Avenue. Either way, the image Prine conjured when writing it was salient. Quote, I had this really vivid picture of this woman standing over the dishwater with soap in her hands and just walking away from it all, Prine said. So I just kept that whole image in my mind when I was writing the song, and I just let it pour out of that character's heart. Another example of Prine's innate ability to write empathetic, character-driven lyrics illuminating overlooked portions of American society, the song is also an early example of Prine's tacit feminism. Rather than talk over the woman, he allowed her to speak for herself, revealing the depths of her dissatisfaction and longing, rather than funneling her feelings through a man's third-party narration. 2 years later, Bonnie Kolak cut an excellent full-band country rock version of Angel from Montgomery, one that's less funereal than Prine's, for the small but mighty Chicago independent label Ovation Records, which cemented a fondness between the two musicians that survived well into their golden years. This was before Bonnie Raitt's cover from Streetlights, which helped propel Prine onto the national stage. Quote, with John, we felt this realness, this depth of a person, Kolak said. That was hardly common. He connected with our humanity, with how people feel. Not everybody can write those lyrics. The first week in October 1970, Roger Ebert, the film critic for the Chicago Sun-Times, wandered into the Fifth Peg during one of Prine's sets after walking out of a particularly rotten film. Ebert had been with the paper for 3 years and was a familiar face in Old Town, where he downed beer and shot specials among friends new and old at a Rourke's Pub, the Old Town Ale House, and the Earl of Old Town. Quote, Old Town and Lincoln Avenue in the 1960s and 70s were where Chicago went to be young, to drink and sing all night, to live forever, Ebert wrote. It's not a stretch to imagine that Ebert might have heard of the buzz surrounding a new songwriter performing a mile from his Old Town stomping grounds, but Ebert attributed the encounter to, quote, sheer blind luck. Music wasn't his beat, but after witnessing Prine's performance, Ebert was moved enough to share the news of a remarkable local talent. Great minds recognize their peers with a particular acuity. That Friday, October 9th, the Sun-Times ran Prine's first review, written by the young film critic. Quote, he appears on stage with such modesty, he almost seems to be backing into the spotlight, Ebert wrote. He sings rather quietly and his guitar work is good, but he doesn't show off. He starts slow. But after a song or two, even the drunks in the room begin to listen to his lyrics. And then he has you. Ebert's article blew the door wide open, and Prine went from being celebrated by scenesters to being the talk of suburbanites. Those who'd never set foot in a folk music club soon angled for a spot at the feet of the singing mailman. Quote, after Roger's piece, things changed, Prine said. He wrote that in place of his weekly movie review, and everybody would turn to the last page to see what the movie was. He was recognized by this time as a Chicago writer, and I was a Chicago kid. And the combination there got the people of Chicago interested to come see this kid. The following night, after Ebert's review ran, was Prine's 24th birthday. He had a gig at the Fifth Peg, so Ann Carroll loaded an oversized sheet cake into the trunk of their Chevelle and surprised him with it at the club. Prine became so popular that a fan even made him a large quilted banner that listed favorite songs: Donald and Lydia, Blue Umbrella, Hello in There, Old People, and Unwitting Redundancy, Quiet Man, and Sam Stone, with Prine's name spelled incorrectly in the middle, John, Pryne. We hung it in our apartment for years, Menelaskino remembered. Overnight, Prine was no longer a neophyte, no longer a mere postal carrier. Like Ebert and Turkle and Sandberg, Nelson Algren and Gwendolyn Brooks, he had become an emblem, a low-key embodiment of Chicago's, he had become an emblem, a living embodiment of Chicago's low-key brilliance, a friend relaying his most pressing thoughts with unfussy, poetic clarity. Like these writers, he was a clarion voice of the everyman, a populist poet, a son of the second city, born of its confines and built by its people. The Chicago issues a particular test of endurance. It will bury you in parky tickets, then bury you in snow, and then drink you under the table. It also pledges its allegiance, its brotherhood, to its true blue hearts. Prine's Midwestern parlance was unpretentious, astute, and heartrending, and with it, he'd won over the city. Prine took a gamble on Chicago's promise. Soon after Ebert's review, he quit his job with the USPS. Quote, I made $2.18 an hour at the post office, and they didn't pay overtime, and they worked us 12 hours a day, Prine said. When I left, the postmaster told me not to take my retirement because I'd be back. I told him, you don't get it. Even if this singing thing doesn't work, I ain't never coming back. Most people would have just kept both jobs and doubled their money, but I just quit and slept all week. As much as Prine insisted that music was a hobby in those days, that he never expected to make it a career, this cavalier move suggests otherwise. As reluctant or uncertain as he might have felt, or thought he felt, or told people he felt, no card-carrying Midwesterner leaves a steady job with a pension without confidence in what happens next. In the wake of Ebert's ink, Chicago had a new poet laureate. His name was John Prine.
Awesome. That was great.
Thanks.
And that is in Erin's book, which you could purchase in the comments. There's a link. I already have my copy here, obviously. That sheet cake, I'm so enthusiastic about that. Tell me, take me back to the beginning. What attracted you to John Prine initially?
Well, John Prine is a family tradition. I fell in love with his music because my dad loved his music. My dad played this self-titled album ad nauseum in our house in the family minivan. And so, I learned about the music and the man from my dad, but it kind of stretches beyond that a little bit more because I have a really strong sense of familiarity with John's origin story because, I'm from the Midwest. I lived in Chicago for a very long time, but I also have family spread across Western Kentucky, just like John. And so, when we would listen to the song Paradise, it was literally singing our family's story. Like he was illuminating our family, our family's people, that region. No one had done that before, right? So I think just through those like personal connections, him and this album have always meant so much to me. And so when I was trying to think about like what would I write a 33 and a third about, I realized like, I write best when I have a personal connection to the work, right? Like I think, write what you know is kind of like a common adage, right? But it works for me. And then I realized it was the 50th anniversary of the album, which was like a great milestone, and that no one had really covered one of his albums in depth like this. So all of those things kind of made me want to pursue this.
The portion, I mean, the book's great in total. The stuff about Paradise is so moving. I got a little teary reading about his father's reaction. And I love the portrait of his father that you have in there. How much of his family history, obviously you knew of his roots, his family roots in Kentucky, but how much were you discovering through the reporting process?
Yeah, I mean, quite a bit actually. Like I had a sense of like, shared provenance with him. And I understand Western Kentucky as a region just through my dad's family. But luckily, I was introduced to one of Prine's cousins who's still living in the region. And she gave me a strong sense of like what their extended family actually looked like, what they ate, what they wore, where they played, how they played, what things cost, you know. So it was really great speaking with Wendy. She's actually thanked in the beginning of the book, because she just gave me like really vivid descriptions of what it was like during their family reunions, what it was like to grow up in Muhlenberg County. And then oddly enough, I went to high school with a girl whose father is also a distant cousin of John Prine. So between those two kind of figures and talking to them at length, they kind of corroborated each other's memories and details. And it was really great. And I feel so lucky to have kind of found those threads.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
You know, the sensibility of John, of being somebody who's both suburban and who has a rural background and is obviously knows what it's like being a participant in a large city. It's so difficult to pin down, but you get it so perfectly. I mean, how much of that were you aiming to kind of define in both like broad ways and also with the specificity that you managed in this book?
I think that was the main goal of the book, because I think what a lot of people don't realize about this album is that it kind of sounds like parable, right? But it's actually all of these images and these people are taken from his day-to-day life, like the things he observed in his postal route, the things that he observed as a boy growing up in Maywood, the things that he observed traveling to Western Kentucky, like they're drawn directly from life for the most part. And so with that, what Prine did is he illuminated these populations that are often overlooked, right? Or underestimated. Like we don't hear people singing songs about folks in Western Kentucky or in the Chicago suburbs or even in Chicago much anymore, right? Like we all have that sense of that flyover country mentality that we've all been plagued with, like living in the Midwest. And so because Prine did that, because he took kind of like these not intentionally bold, but like implicitly bold moves to highlight these folks, I wanted to do the same thing with the book, right? To really like illuminate what he was writing about, to make sure that it was understood that like this is taken from his life, and he did these things intentionally. And this is why it should be celebrated, both the act and the folks. So yeah, I really wanted this book to be a really salient, detailed story of place, as well as the record.
Yeah. It's also fascinating to read the history of Old Town School of Folk Music kind of emerging as he was starting to, figure out figure out his voice as a musician, figure out how to play. That the depth of care that you put into showing how the region transformed both before he like was born and then as he was kind of growing up is really, really amazing. I swear I'm coming up with a question as I build on this, but what when you pitch a 33 to third, you have to have a general outline for the book. As you were reporting, did any of your plans change?
Weirdly, no. Like I think just because I was so familiar with the album and the places, I had a really strong sense of what I wanted to do. And I think maybe that's why I was picked, because maybe that came through. It's like, okay, I kind of already I thought about this for like, 40 years at this point. So yeah, not a lot changed. Like the titles of chapters changed. And like, as I uncovered details through my reporting, like that changed. But I had a sense of like, that I wanted to write about the Chicago folk music scene because it is overlooked, right? But that's why Prine became who he was, because his older brother Dave got swept up in the local folk music scene and like imparted that onto his brother to kind of like help John out of this like delinquency, out of this like teenage delinquency that he was sort of kind of like participating in.
Greaser John Prine, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But like when we talk about historical folk music scenes, people think about Greenwich Village and San Francisco and maybe Boston. They don't think about Chicago. So that was like, this was very much me like wanting to write about the underdog, and make sure that like, people understood that this was a big touring circuit that like all of the big names played here too. One of the first big clubs was here, you know, and that all led to John Prine, right? So yeah, I think that answers your question. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it does. Also, around 7:45, we're going to open up the floor up to general questions from the audience. If you have any, please put them in the chat. And when it's time, I'll call your question. But I remember I was so excited when you told me that you had landed a pitch for 33 1/3 and that it was about this book. And then the pandemic hit and John passed. How did that kind of affect your reporting?
Yeah, I actually had pitched it after he passed. So
wow, my sense of time is so messed up. I'm sorry.
Time is no longer linear. It's just this blob turning on itself. But yeah, I mean, those feelings were still very raw, like inside of me. And I knew that it was going to be an additional hurdle because I couldn't interview him, right? Like, I mean, which is so sad. But I knew that there were a lot of good interviews out there. Actually, Bob Mayer, who's here with us, he conducted one of the last interviews with Prine and was so gracious and shared his recordings with me. So there was a lot of cool stuff that I was able to include from Bob's interview that didn't make it into a story that was new. Greg Cott shared reporting with me. So I knew that there were ways to get around it. I would have loved to interview Prine in person, obviously. But I think just with, I think there's this like rallying that happens when we talk about John Prine because it's such a like sphere of friendship, you know, for like the particular weirdos who love him. So like, I think when you're pursuing anything about John Prine, like people want to help you. And I just felt very lucky that I had that support. And the other thing I'll say that I didn't realize until after I wrote the book was that this is the first book that people in Prine's life participated in. I think there have been other books or book written where for whatever reason, his manager didn't want him to participate and therefore like his friends and family didn't participate. So this was the first time that folks in his life really agreed to speak on the record to report for a book. And just the fact that like that all came together was really helpful as well. Like I feel super lucky to have talked to his first wife, Ann Carroll, his brothers, the living members of the Memphis Boys who played on the record. Like it was just this really magical, just like set of dominoes, you know, that all just kind of fell over and led to this thing. So, but bittersweet because, you know, John is no longer with us.
Was there anyone in your reporting that kind of you didn't expect would want to talk to you that ended up being, you know, involved in the writing and reporting? Yeah,
Ray Tate. Ray Tate was the second person who ran the Old Town School. So it was Frank Hamilton founded the school, and then he left to go join the Weavers, which was a huge folk music collective at the time. And so this guy Ray Tate took over, and there's a little bit of disgrace around what happened with the Old Town School under Tate's leadership. I think it really, it was having financial problems and people disagreed with his decisions. And so I think he has been really reluctant to speak to people about that time in his life. And yeah, just through some networking with folks related to OTS, I was able to speak to him, and he, you know, he's older, but he's sharp as a tack still, and was very open with me about what he remembered about having Prine as a guitar student and about running the Fifth Peg, and that felt like a major coup.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
The level of detail is again amazing. I mean, there are a few instances where, along with that quilt, you mentioned like they spelled Prine's name incorrectly, which, you know, when you have a last name of, you know, of only a handful of letters, how don't expect that to happen that often. The process of doing research beyond the interviews, how long did that take? Where were you looking? How deep were you going? And when did you know, like, oh, I might have gone too far? Or I don't mean to get ahead of myself, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I love details. You know that about me. I love the details. But yeah, there are several archives that I used. The Old Town School maintains its own archive, And the archivist there was really helpful in like pulling anything that could possibly be relevant, both related to the school's history and also to Prine and kind of his buddy, Steve Goodman and Bonnie Kolak. I used newspapers.com, right? Because all of the newspapers are there. Not all of this, sometimes actually isn't there. So I used the Chicago Public Library system to get the newspapers that I couldn't find on newspapers.com. And then Rock's Back Pages, that archive, was also really, really helpful. I have a subscription to that just because I'm like to do research in general. So it was, you know, pulling up old interviews and stuff. It was sort of limitless there, kind of. So yeah, between that and then just like people like Bob and Greg and other folks who provided their recordings, I had kind of a wealth of material. And then there's a great book I recommend if you're a fan of Steve Goodman, or you want to know more about Steve and John's friendship. There's a biography of Steve Goodman that's like encyclopedia like width. It's a really fat biography, but it's excellent, super detailed. And I read that to kind of get some context around some of the stories, and that was really helpful too.
Their friendship is so touching too. I mean, it's really, to me, it says a lot about the character of the scene that they were in and the character of Chicago. So much of this book feels like it's establishing the character of Chicago in a way for somebody who either is familiar with this place or isn't familiar with this place. How crucial was kind of developing that. I realize this is a little similar to what I've asked before, but how crucial was developing this sort of through line of Chicago's character through the generations to now to the overall narrative of the book?
Yeah, it was super important. And I think by kind of delving into the scene and Goodman and the Holsteins and Bonnie Kolak, and they were all really friendly with one another. Like, you know, there can be this kind of cutthroat nature, this competitive nature to the music business, right? Like we've all heard those stories. And I think that sense of camaraderie and friendship is sustained today in Chicago. Chicago has this enthusiasm for its sons and daughters that is totally singular in my mind. It's like so much more vibrant and enthusiastic than like anything else I've ever witnessed. And there is that sense of like sustained sense of camaraderie and wanting to help one another, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I really wanted to convey that. And obviously the Prine Goodman relationship is key to that. And it's kind of like the most important part, but like all of those kind of secondary folks too. I mean, just that chapter that I read where Bonnie Kolak's talking about Prine, and really she was the star at the time. Prine and Goodman weren't getting the level of coverage, the record sales that she was, right? Like she was the one that was supposed to go off to LA and sign the big record deal. It just happened, didn't happen that way. But locally she was the star. And so the fact that she was heaping so much praise on Prine at the time, I think just shows like how much of like a familial environment the Chicago scene was. And I think, you know, that transcends genre in Chicago. I think it's not just the folk music scene, it's all different kinds of scenes, and that persists today.
How has your relationship with this album changed now that you've written this book?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think it has. I think some folks might say they're burned out on listening to an album, but I'm not. Like, I can still listen to the songs and love them. I love, actually, one thing that I learned in my reporting that I think brings sort of a newness to my ears is that the recording of this album was a massive experiment, right? It was like the first folk record on Atlantic Records because they were a soul and R&B label. The Memphis Boys had never really played on a folk record before, so they weren't quite sure what they were going to do. The producer, Arif Mardin, had never produced a folk album before. And so just this like kind of alien quality that kind of runs through this album, I had never really realized before, right? Because you think like all these people are monster players and producers, and the studio is so heralded, it's so mythic, right? And so I never would have had the sense that this was such a green kind of a thing. So that makes me appreciate it that much more, because all of these people were sort of willing to dive into the unknown and to kind of help one another along the way. And I think that they produce something very remarkable. Yeah.
I mean, at the same time, you really do a great job of establishing John as an individual outside of his myth, so that by the time that he gets into the studio and he's like, wow, these people can, like outplay me. What am I supposed to do? That clicks, and it also makes the magic of what they were able to produce together that much more mystical and affecting.
Yeah. I love how Reggie Young, the guitar player, at a certain point, like kind of took the guys to the side and he was like, so the thing about this music is the words. And like, I really want to encourage y'all to go back and really like read the words and listen to the words, because I think that will help direct your playing. And I'm certain that there had to have been some sort of shift after that, right? And I just love that kind of like imagining that scene over a dinner table or whatever.
And then there's the album cover, which I don't think it's a spoiler to talk about this, but sort of the setup was like, oh, these two Chicagoans will get along great. And John comes out of it being like, what are they doing? I've never seen like like hay before. What do they think they're selling? Like, who do they think I am? Which, given everything that you've done, setting up his, his background and identity, it totally makes sense. Like, yeah, what are they doing here? I mean, if I had come across just this album, I would have been like, oh, this is a country album, but it absolutely is not.
Yeah, it's a really country infused folk album, but like that's what a New York record label would think of a guy from Chicago, right? Like, oh, people in Chicago sit on bales of hay, like, I just think it's like, again, it's like they didn't really know what to do with him. This whole thing was a process of like trying to figure out what to do with this guy who's not quite folk, not quite country, from an area that like isn't celebrated, right? And so yeah, I mean, even though that photographer was from Chicago, the photographer had been swept up in the San Francisco kind of rock scene, and he'd done a lot of live photography. And, like Prine, he captured his subjects in their natural environments, which I think was like a common thread. So it's really like perplexing that he that he chose this setting, but a testament to Prine's kind of like a sense of humor is he could laugh about it later. Like he told so many jokes about him sitting on a bale of hay, and his wife Ann Carroll told so many jokes about it. And I just think that's great that he has such a good nature about it.
You didn't get to interview him for this, but the intro of your book has this really charming anecdote of a run-in essentially with him at a Grammy event. Would you mind kind of relaying that now?
Yeah. So I guess that was something new. I wasn't sure that I was going to write about this because I get really uncomfortable inserting myself into other people's narratives. But I thought it would work for the intro. So basically I went to a Grammy event and I woke up that morning and I had laryngitis. I had just kind of gotten over a cold, and I woke up and I could not speak. Like no sound would come out of my mouth. And I felt fine otherwise. I wasn't sick. I didn't have a fever. So I sort of weighed the absurdity of like going to such a social event, being unable to speak. But I was like, I don't want to miss this. So I put on my dress, and by the time I got there, I was starving because I had forgotten to eat. So I ran up to the seafood bar and started heaping a plate with oysters, like so many oysters, like a obscene amount of oysters. And I turned around and I had a plate with 30 oysters on it and a plate with lemons. And I look up and John Prine is sitting in the middle of the room. And I can't speak. He's sitting like 6 feet away from me. And so I just looked at him and I said, "You're my hero." And he looked at me and went, "Thumbs up." And that's my one John Prine exchange. That's the closest I ever got to the guy. But it feels really meaningful because I think I impressed him with my appetite. I think he was like very impressed with my plate, which is like a great compliment, right, for Midwesterners.
So. Right, and the book is Midwestern, recognizing Midwestern. Like, have you since it's been published, I mean, it's only been out for a little while, but have you heard from Midwesterners who have said like, I see myself in this, or who've been touched by this book?
Yeah, I think I've had quite a few complimentary emails come in just saying like, thank you for writing about people and places that don't get written about, that sort of thing. And my dad loved it, which is the most important thing to me. So thanks.
It's really sweet. Your dad, who's also a reporter.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been so fortunate enough to see you work on, this is your second book, and I've seen you work on your Molina book, which is great. Everyone should read that too if you haven't yet. What have you thought about your next steps? What does this mean for you as a writer? How do you grow from here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did a podcast a little while ago with my buddy Steve Hayden, who's also a music journalist, and he pointed out that I keep writing about Midwestern songwriters. And I was like, I've really backed myself into a corner, haven't I? But I think, I think that's my zone. I think that like really for me, it's best to write what you know and also what you feel. Like for me, if there's no feeling there, it's really hard for me to write about it in any sort of like capable way. So I think my next project is going to be centered on the Heartland rock movement in the 80s, and sort of Heartland rock as a megaphone for working class resistance under Reagan. I'm writing the proposal now. We'll see if it happens. I think it will. I've had like some positive feedback early on, but yeah, I think I'm going to keep going with it and keep writing about sort of these everyday folks that I relate to. So that's the next project. Well, fingers crossed it happens.
That's so cool. That sounds so cool. I want to read that right now.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I've read so many books about punk in the 80s, and that is like a refutation of Reagan, and that just sounds like something that I've been missing and wanting to, like, I want that right now.
Yeah, that was my thinking. Like everyone knows about like the punk movement and the hardcore movement as like resisting Reagan, right? But no one thinks about like this really mainstream music as like a mouth for the resistance. So yeah, hopefully that's the next one.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Were you listening to anything else in addition to John Prine self-titled while you were writing this?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't super familiar with Steve Goodman's music, and so I really became acquainted with him. I had a pretty deep familiarity with Bonnie Kolak's music just because I have a soft spot for female folk singers, but also like there was a time in Chicago where all of her records were like $1 at all of the used bins, which I thought was weird. So I had a lot of her records, but Steve's music I didn't know very well. So I feel like I got to know his music. I spent a lot of time with just like OTS adjacent folks and what they were performing and how they sound and whether they played a banjo or a guitar or 12-string guitar. So yeah, I would say a lot of those folks, and also the Memphis Boys, what they did, and I wanted to kind of like know everything that they had done. So I went through all of the hits. I actually became really enamored with the record from Elvis in Memphis. And that has become my favorite Elvis record as a product of researching this book. Like I knew the record and I knew Suspicious Minds, the song, but like, I just didn't realize that it's actually probably the best Elvis record. So yeah, that was like a big discovery for me. And yeah.
That's so cool. That's how you love what you do, is you keep learning new things that are adjacent to what you're working on and getting stuck on that.
Yeah.
It's 7:45. If we have any questions from the audience, please enter them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to keep pestering Erin myself. And, it's good to get some other voices in there. Yeah. Erin, you teach. I've been fortunate enough to talk to your class. Have you talked to your students about, working on this book at all?
Yeah, they were all very curious. The 33 1/3, particularly because anyone can pitch the series. So yeah, we actually did a little session about, how to ideate and how to form a proposal and what I think worked about mine. And it was really exciting because my students, I teach many classes, but the one class that I really love is a music journalism class that I teach, because I made the syllabus and it's like very much my jam. So yeah, I really talked to the 11 students in that class about like how they can apply what they're interested in to this iconic series. And they were very enthusiastic about it. But just in general, I think that there are a lot more music books being published today than even when I was pitching the Molina book. Like, I feel like there was a period where music books were kind of a hard sell for publishers, but that's not really the case anymore. I think we're seeing more and more of them. So yeah, my students have certainly been excited about like the thought that like they can do this too. And I'm an open book about that and trying to help them. So that was a cool experience for me.
That's awesome. We do have a question from Daniel, who is a fantastic professor and a punk writer. He says, can you talk a bit about the opportunities and limitations that come with focusing on a single record versus a book that would have been more about Prine's career generally?
Yeah, I took a really liberal interpretation with this. Like, I think, you know, some of the books, people kind of riff on their personal experience, right? Or some like really do a blow by blow of how the record was made. And I made it into more of sort of an anthropological study, right? It really became a book of time and place. So I think that was an opportunity because the series does let you kind of find your own zone within it. It doesn't dictate that it has to be one thing or another. I think that was an opportunity. I think the limitations were that I didn't get to go as deep as I probably would have. Even though this is a detailed book, I am really in love with details. And I think I probably could have written something twice as long about this period in Prine's life, to be honest. But it had to be 33,000 words. So yeah, that was hard for me to kind of edit myself and be like, what are the most essential bits here? Thanks, Daniel.
A follow-up from me, would you consider, doing another book about Prine?
Maybe, yeah. I had a really wild idea about trying to write a script. Because I think that this discovery story is so cinematic in a way, like it's so earthen and there are all these textures and all of these things that we can recall in terms of like this period in the 70s, like this unassuming guy with like his fluffed up rooster hair and his Canadian tuxedo and his Martin guitar and like a, dirty Chicago nightclub. Like I love like all of the visual things that I imagine about this. So I've actually thought about writing a script about kind of Prine's background and discovery and sort of like seeing how it might manifest visually. But yeah, I mean, I would love to write more about Prine. He's one of my favorites.
That rules.
Yeah.
We got a question here from Jen. The last song he wrote was beautiful, from his first album to his last song. How might you summarize the evolution of his music?
Oh, thanks, Jen. Well, what's incredible about Prine is his last record, The Tree of Forgiveness, was his highest charting record of his career. So if we think about like all of his iconic songs, the guy didn't miss up until his last days, right? Like that song, Knocking on My Screen Door, I don't know if that's the title, but you know what song I'm talking about. Like that's an incredible song. And he wrote that like just a couple of years before he died. Like that album hit number 5 on the Billboard charts. Like it's insane. So I would say that although like in the middle of his career, I think he struggled a little bit within the major label system because they weren't marketing him and they didn't really know where to put him. I think the songwriting was super strong, but maybe the infrastructure wasn't as supportive. To really kind of have this upward trend toward the end of his life on his own terms, on his own label, I think is really remarkable. And something that Prine did that people don't talk about a lot is he founded one of the first artist-owned record labels. He was one of the first people to say like, screw you major label system, I'm out. And then he, in the 80s, started his own label. And he was one of the first people to do that. And so really, for the last half of his career, he was truly working on his own terms. So I think it's very remarkable. So I would say, I don't know how many people will be able to do that, you know, Bob Dylan maybe. But yeah, I mean, he's pretty singular in that respect.
And that question from Jen is from Miles. She says,
Hi, Miles.
Zach, I had no idea about this. I'm going to read this great question. Really appreciate this conversation. As a person whose own father played John Prine for his kids, I'm thinking about how the vivid images were to me at age 6 and 7, grass growing around, brains, etc. No pressure, but I'd be curious to hear any reflections about holding lifelong relationships with Prine's songs. Congrats on the book. We'll order mine tonight. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks, Zach. Zach is my favorite person that I worked with at Time Out Chicago, by the way. He's an old coworker and he was my absolute favorite at that job. Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know if you could tell, but even when I read, sometimes I get a little choked up because it's very personal and it's very emotional. And I just have, like Zach, I have these like vivid memories of like singing Paradise in the family minivan while driving to Caldwell County, Kentucky. It's so visceral. And there are just all of these memories that instantly kind of like come to mind, these images, these like fluffy clouds off the Penarel Parkway in Kentucky, or, you know, my dad, who is a newscaster who wears a suit to work, but on weekends, he would come home and change into Carhartt because that's what he grew up around. So he would change into his Carhartt and he would mow the grass or trim the bush or whatever, like in his workwear. I like to say that my dad was the first like hipster who wore workwear like in the 80s. Yeah, so I have those really visceral connections, and it's all comes out every time I listen to this album. Like sometimes it's so much that I like cry, you know, that I almost can't listen to it all the way through, or like I can't listen to Paradise at a particular time because it recalls the time in my life that doesn't exist anymore, you know, that only exists in my memory. So yeah, thanks for asking that, Zach.
Thanks, Zach. This is from Meredith. How many times do I have to listen to Hello in There to not cry about it?
Meredith is my sister.
Oh.
Thank you for asking that question, Mare. I don't think that there are enough times. Like, you know, you have the same experience that I do, but yeah, that one gets me every time. Far From Me as well. That's actually my favorite song on the album is Far From Me. And that is such a like touching classic country song that it like really socks me in the gut every time I listen to it. So yeah, I think that we'll never not be crying about this.
You know, you mentioned having mixed feelings about putting your own kind of story in the book, but it's very clear that the personal connection that you have to his music without even having to kind of address that. How much of John Prine's, you know, personality kind of resonated with you as you were writing this? Did you kind of, beyond obviously the biographical detail, did you recognize yourself in and feel a kinship with?
I really relate to Prine as an introvert. You know, I relate to him as a Midwesterner and as someone who has family in Kentucky and all of those things, and as a Chicagoan. But I really relate to him in the sense that, like, you know, I too am the person at the party in the corner, like looking around, but thinking of other things, you know, like I too am the person who doesn't assert myself in group settings, who kind of prefers to observe and to kind of record things in my head. And he was the same way. And when that theme kept coming out, like when his brothers brought that up and his cousin Wendy and his first wife, I was like, I'm that guy too. So I really related to that he really chewed on his thoughts a long time before he said anything. He wasn't super performative or outgoing. He was in fact, he was a reluctant performer. And I feel the exact same way. I am not a natural public speaker. I am not the life of the party. And so I think as that kind of like sensitive, introverted soul, we had that connection. And I hope that came through as well.
Yeah, I mean, you made having a mail route sound like, a thing that I want right now. Just having that time to like think and daydream is really great.
Yeah, that was riding the 66 bus for me, from downtown back home in Humboldt Park.
Joe asks, any insights into the private versus public Prine? Was there a difference?
I don't think there really was. Maybe, he learned to perform, right? So I think in the back half of his career, he was much more comfortable on stage and much more comfortable kind of spinning yarn to audiences. And but in the beginning, he was super quiet. And I read that in that chapter where he talked about like how it was really painful for him to kind of be in the spotlight. But no, I don't think that there was a lot of divide there. One thing I will say is this didn't make it into the book, but folks from either OTS or like his brothers would talk about how Prine was really uncomfortable with fans approaching him. And at first, I think he tried to be gracious about it. But kind of in latter days, he would just tell people like, hey, I'm trying to eat my mashed potatoes with my friend. And so I think that kind of carried on. And in a way, I think that I find that very authentic, right? Because he wasn't suddenly going to become the super social outgoing guy, right? Just for the sake of a fan. And so yeah, I don't think that there were a lot of performative qualities. And that was one thing too, that was common in his interviews that he gave. He gives a lot of repeat answers. And so it was really nice to have access to interviews, like to stuff that wasn't published, because I think Prine was uncomfortable in interview settings and talking about himself. So he gave a lot of the same answers over the years. So to find those extra bits that were like sort of a surprise that hadn't been printed before were really, really great. But yeah, I think in his heart, he was always just kind of a regular, quiet guy. And I don't think he really changed that much. I think he just lived authentically.
I skipped. Jen had a comment earlier. I think your screenplay needs to include your personal narrative.
Oh, thanks.
I think we got time for a couple more questions. If anyone has any questions that are burning in them. Before that, I mean, you mentioned telling your students about how to pitch a 33 1/3. Since this is the beginning of a series about 33 1/3, what advice do you have for anyone on here that might be interested in writing one?
Yeah, I would say if you want to pitch one, there's obviously having the idea and having the sense of how you want to tell the story of the album. But there's also other things that you have to think about. You have to think about marketing, unfortunately, like that's just a reality of the book world. So you have to have a sense of like who the audience is, how they might learn about and connect to your work, how, it may be disseminated online. Like you have to think about those kind of things. So if you're picking an artist who sold 200 records in their lifetime, you have to figure out like, how are you going to make that artist that sold 200 records in their lifetime, how are you going to get that to someone who's never heard of them, right? Like that's a hurdle. So you have to think about those things. And the other thing I recommend is to just really make sure 33 1/3 has very specific proposal instructions, and follow them to the letter, because that will show the publisher that you can actually finish this thing first, right? Because I think that they've commissioned some in the past where the person just didn't finish it or just couldn't do it. And that you pay attention to details and that your copy's clean and all of those kind of things that help. So that's what I would recommend. Like have a sense of like who the book is for and how you might market it, and also follow the proposal to the letter, proposal instructions.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna have a lot of trouble with my Jan deck 33 1/3 pitch. I think 200 albums is something for him to aspire to. If there are no more questions, I think that's great. But it's 8:00. If you haven't bought Erin's book yet, again, the link is in the chat. I highly recommend buying it. It's terrific.
I want to say one more thing, which is Leor's work with the reader was anthologized recently. Leor is an incredible reporter. His breadth of knowledge about music in Chicago is unparalleled. And you can buy his book on the Reader's website, I believe. So if you're interested in music across all genres in Chicago, buy Leor's book.
Thank you, Erin.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you coming. This was super fun.
This is so cool.
Yes. Thank you all for coming. Give me a second, sorry. We have copies of the book. I don't know if you can see behind me. We have a whole row of them, plus a stack in the other room. Please, holidays are going to be here before you know it. So start stocking up. We're going to have signed book plates. Erin's going to send some signed book plates over to us. This has been such a treat. I'm so glad this is the first book that we did because of the connection, Chicago connection. And I didn't really think about that beforehand, but it was a happy accident. And you guys were fantastic. Leor, you really came prepared, and Erin, so happy for you and excited for your future. And when you do publish that next book, we want first dibs for that event. So yeah, please go online, go to our website, buy many copies. One last thing, and if you guys could stick around for a little bit, just for a few seconds after we sign off. So I moved to Chicago in '95. I moved from California to open a tower. I worked for Tower Records and to open a tower store in the suburbs of Chicago. And the music scene here was like nothing I'd ever experienced. And hearing you talk about that scene and the clubs and the bars and really brought me back. And I thank you for that. It was a nice stroll back in time. So thank you so much. And thanks everyone for showing up tonight. Stay tuned, watch our social media presence, because we are going every month. We're going to be hosting a 33 and a third author, and we're so excited about this prospect. We already have sort of the next 6 months planned out. 33 and a third is putting out some pretty good stuff this year, including the National for Boxer and a Cat Power album, and what's the George Michael. I mean, there's going to be some interesting. They're doing a lot of interesting things. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone.